So welcome everybody. We are in the second to the last official class of the series. And, for those of you who are in the live stream versus catching the recording, we do have like a whole month between this class and our very last class because I'm going to be away traveling. But so you'll have plenty of time to catch up on bonus classes, recordings, homework if you want to be doing that. However you feel like using that time or just having some downtime. And so for our second to last class, I really love this topic. It's always timely, and it's even more timely, it seems like, in the last couple of years, and that is the immune system. And I think that this class is one of the easier classes to grasp in the series because a lot of folks are already really familiar with many of the herbs. Some of them are really common culinary herbs, and even the more overt medicinal herbs like, say, echinacea and astragalus and elderberry, a lot of folks are familiar because this is one of our gateway topics for getting into herbal medicine in the first place, is to use them to support our immune systems for just like everyday respiratory infections and those kinds of things. So we have a couple different things that we're going to be doing in today's class. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about the immune system in general, but particularly as it pertains to infections. We're going to go into prevention support and when you get sick, and just kind of like our key immune herbs to consider for respiratory infections like the cold and flu. And, many of these things are probably applicable to COVID, although COVID is its own, like, much messier, more confusing, more mercurial, more potentially dangerous scenario. But that said, a lot of our herbs that we might use for the common cold and flu probably do support us and do seem to support us with COVID infections as well. So I will be tying that in, even though officially our focus really is more on everyday colds and flu. And then we're going to be making some remedies. We're going to make elderberry syrup as our primary remedy. And I'm hoping that we will also have enough time to do a quick elderberry rosehip oxymel and a ginger tea. However, we'll see how time is going. And then at the very end of the class, we'll be coming in to talk more about allergies and support on that side of things. And so that's my plan for the class. It's always over full for our 3 hours, but that's kind of how almost every class in this series is. And, it's totally fine. We'll just roll with it and see what we can accomplish in our 3 hours together. So these. In addition to my usual disclaimers, I do like to make a few extra ones that pertain to COVID, since I cannot help but bring it up in today's class. And that's something that's certainly on a lot of people's minds, although maybe in some ways a little bit less now that we're, entering, what is it, I guess, year 3 of the pandemic. Things are in some ways mellowed out. But, as I mentioned, we're mainly really focused on cold and flu, but a lot of these things probably are applicable to COVID infections. But COVID infections can be really complicated and really different. Some people have no symptoms. Some people have mild, cold flu type symptoms, but nothing too serious. Some people have really severe symptoms. Some people get hospitalized. Some people die. Some people have really, like, non-upper respiratory type symptoms associated with it, like clots and increased risk of stroke and menstrual irregularities, which, some of those can actually happen with other, kind of more serious, weird infections beyond just COVID. But they do present a little bit bigger of a challenge to us than just regular colds and flus. So, so just keep that, like, grain of salt in mind, that I'm not dismissing COVID as merely another cold and flu, although sometimes for some people that does appear to be all that it is. And then there's a whole nother, like, can of worms when it comes to long COVID, which seems to affect some people regardless of how severe their initial COVID infection was. And that's really not at all related to the things that we're talking about today. I am not a COVID expert. I don't work directly with clients much these days because of my schedule, and my practice really isn't set up for acute care. So while I do have current clients who work with COVID that we've kind of consulted on casually, I've had it, family members have had it, and I've definitely been taking classes and following the literature and the forums. I'm not somebody who has a lot of, a significant body of clinical experience working with COVID. And even for the cold and flu, my experience is a little bit more casual for that, because when people do come to see me as a clinical herbalist, when I'm seeing clients, new clients, usually they're not coming to me for the cold or flu. They're usually coming to me for something bigger and more chronic. And then if we do end up consulting on respiratory infections, it's, somebody who's already a regular client who reaches out for some little extra support. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, but I have lots of personal experience. I've worked in supplement aisles over the years for cold and flu stuff. And of course, my own, personal health and well-being. And you'll probably hear a variety of my own and my family stories tonight. And generally speaking, when it comes to research for all of this, whether we're talking about cold and flu and COVID, the research is kind of limited. There is certainly some research on plants for cold and flu, and some of it's pretty solid. The elderberry research is pretty supportive. However, also not a lot of research, but what we have is generally very positive. We have lots and lots and lots of echinacea research, but the research for echinacea is just like all over the place of whether it works or doesn't work or sort of works or is all in your head or whatever. Different studies say pretty wildly different things. So there's not really much of a consensus there. And then there is other research on other herbs. But in a lot of ways, this isn't as robustly researched of an area as you would expect, considering, how common of a set of issues this can be. And then around COVID, there's a lot of theoretical studies that have been put together applying like other info we know about herbs and saying, well, it should work for COVID. There are some clinical trials underway that haven't been completed yet. There are quite a few, and there are a handful that have been completed, but especially for our herbs that we tend to turn to most in Western herbalism, there's very little human clinical trial research that's actually been completed. But, there's still a lot in process. So hopefully with time, we'll have more. Just because there's not research on something doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't work, though. And certainly for colds and flus and just general infections, we have a lot of history of use of herbs to support us. So today's tea is one of my favorite herbal beverage teas and medicinal teas. And I have a lot of different ways that I will vary it up depending upon what's going on and what I feel like that day. But at its basis, it's elderberries and hibiscus, and a little bit more hibiscus than elderberries, just because I really like the way hibiscus tastes. And then I often will add some schizandra berries. So elderberries are our primary immune system herb, and we're going to be focusing a bit on that later on in class. But elderberries really shine early in infection, or possibly in that like preventative, or you're going to be susceptible kind of phase. And what it seems to do is go in and help block the virus out of cells so it can't replicate and spread as much as it might otherwise. So it's not that you don't get sick, but it seems like it really knocks it back quite a bit, and that it can reduce the duration and the severity of a cold or a flu. And there is some human research showing that does, seem to bear out. And it tastes pretty good. It's okay tasting. It's not super exciting, but it's easy to blend with other things. And tea is a great way to work with it, because when it's dried and heated, it's going to be in one of its safest forms. And it's actually a pretty good way of delivering the medicine to the body as well. Hibiscus is there more as a supportive herb because it gives it more of that yummy berry flavor and color. We've been turning to hibiscus in the last couple classes as a significant flavoring, coloring agent in our teas that does also have medicinal properties. It's not quite as specific to the cold and flu. However, it is a little bit soothing. I find that if you have hibiscus hot, strong, with a good amount of honey in it, it can be very soothing for sore throat. And so there probably are additional benefits. It's anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, but it's not really our main immune support or antimicrobial herb by any means. And then schizandra berries are in there as a bonus if you happen to have them. Schizandra berries have gotten quite expensive, and they are potentially supportive in the moment, but where they're really helpful is long-term. They're an adaptogenic herb that also supports the liver. That's what it's most famous for. But in addition to that, it does seem to have an affinity for strengthening the resilience of the immune system and the respiratory system. And there are a variety of adaptogenic herbs, the herbs we use for stress and longevity and vitality, that also seem to have supportive effects on kind of like deeply nourishing the immune system so that we're less likely to get sick, that we're better able to fight infections and to modulate even when people's immune systems are doing kind of wonky things and maybe get overactive. Oftentimes those immune adaptogen herbs are still really helpful. And so it's nice. It is, I use a little less of that in the blend because it is a strong flavor. It's sweet and sour and pungent, but it's especially sour and kind of peppery flavor and a little bit bitter. So I use a little bit less of that. It is also a little bit energizing, and so and to varying degrees depending upon the person. So it can be supportive for cognition, but sometimes that energizing effect might be good or not good depending upon what's going on, when you're taking it, if it ends up disrupting your sleep or something like that. It's not as energizing as a lot of other herbs are, but it also depends on the person. So I usually like to steep that pretty strong. You can add a lot of other things to it too. You could add ginger, you can add lemon, you can add butterfly blue pea flowers for a little extra color. Some of my students were creating a blend and they added lemon balm to a somewhat similar blend, and that was really lovely. So a lot of times I kind of do these sort of mashups of those combos, but with the elderberry hibiscus as the base. And for today's tea in your kit, it's the elderberry hibiscus and schizandra berry that you have. And it does taste a lot better with honey or some sort of sweetener in it. It's otherwise really, really tart. So if you wanted to have it without a sweetener, I might brew it a little weaker, which also means it might not be as medicinally potent, but it might be, way too sour, especially if you have a sensitive stomach, if you were having it unsweetened. So I'm curious to hear how you like it. I added 1 teaspoon of honey, which is pretty good, but I'm almost thinking it would have been even better to add 2 teaspoons of honey. So I switched the slides around a little bit versus the way I've taught this class in the past and the way that I originally sent you the slides. I'll probably be updating that for you, but really it's not different slides. It's just the order is a little different because I thought it made more sense to give us a little basic A&P at the beginning than I used to. And good, I'm glad to hear, Vicki, that you're liking the tea without honey in it. So your immune system is something that needs to be everywhere and anywhere because we can come into contact with germs anywhere and everywhere in the body. And you're going to particularly see your immune system being particularly active on the surfaces, the barriers that are most likely to come into contact, at least initially, with those infectious organisms. So, we have some aspects of our immune system that are on our skin. Our skin in and of itself is an immune system barrier, our digestive system and our mucus lining and our stomach acid, because some things can come in through that like kind of donut hole of our digestive system, as well as our respiratory system, because it's just such an easy way for infections to come in through our mouth and through our nose, and then potentially also come down into our lungs. So our big focus today is on those upper respiratory infections. And then in addition to that, we, and having immune system cells, immune cells everywhere, we also see a pretty significant amount of the immune system functioning within the lymphatic system. So you might remember from our detox class that the lymphatic system is one of the systems associated with detoxification. It helps clean those interstitial fluids that are outside of the cells, outside of the bloodstream, outside of the organ, just kind of that ocean of fluid that's in our bodies. And the lymphatic system tends to filter that and help detoxify. And it also plays a role in digesting fat, and it's closely associated with the digestive system, the bloodstream, and ultimately some waste gets excreted out back into the bloodstream, where it ultimately gets filtered out later through the liver and the feces and the kidneys and all of that. But a lot of additional sort of quote unquote cleaning action happens in the lymph nodes. And so we have a lot of immune cells living in that lymphatic system and doing a lot of the fighting and cleaning up of infections throughout the lymph vessels and the lymph fluid and throughout the body and in those lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes, so in this particular, it's not a great picture here, but in this picture, it's kind of like these little spots. We also have lymph glands, but we have the lymph nodes. And in those, there's like a little powerhouse of immune cells. It's kind of like, I do a lot of analogies with military and fighting battles with the immune system. It's just a really easy set of analogies to make. And so you can think of those lymph nodes as like your little like your boot camps and your agencies and things where they're training and growing and testing out the immune system cells, where we bring like the really bad guys in to deal with them. And so that's one of the major sort of central offices of the immune system, but things are also happening everywhere else. And within our immune system, we have a couple different components. So we have many different components, but two different kind of like aspects of the immune system. So one is your innate immune system, and that's the immune system that you're born with, that regular animals have as well. It's a very primitive immune system, but it's effective. And so any sort of germs or perceived bad critters that come into the body will meet a somewhat similar response of the immune system. We'll see fevers, we'll see mucus, we'll see histamine, certain immune cells that go in and deal with that. And you kind of do the same thing every time you come into contact with it. We have another immune system that develops over time, and that's our acquired or our adaptive immune system. And that's the immune system that's more sophisticated. It's what allows us to get sick with the flu once for the year and then hopefully adapt to where we create antibodies to it so that the next time we come in contact with that same exact flu virus, we might not even notice that we were exposed and not get sick at all because the immune system just responds so swiftly at dealing with it. So my analogy for this would be if you had, a mall and you had some folks who came into the mall and were causing lots of disruption and vandalizing and stealing and all of that. So it might take a moment for the mall security system to even realize that those folks were a threat, and then to deal with them might be kind of messy, to like fight with them and get them to the ground and then escort them out of the mall and say, all right, like you're done, and then we have to clean up the damage from that. So that's sort of what happens with the innate immune system. Now with the adaptive, what happens is after that first time, we have the macrophages. They're the ones that like basically gobble up pathogens and other things. And the macrophages go and they hold on to a part of that protein and they show that to the acquired immune system and say like, this is who bothered us. We don't like them. They're bad. Don't let them back in again. You're going to fight them next time they come in. So it's sort of the equivalent of putting out that APB to all the mall security staff and putting pictures up in all the stores to say like, this is, these are the folks who are causing problems. Don't even let them in the building. As soon as they come in, just shuffle them right back out again. And so that's sort of how that adaptive immune system happens, that you come into contact, your immune system responds very swiftly, and you don't even really get sick, or if you do get sick, it might be very minor at that, hopefully. And so that's where your antibodies, a lot of your T cells are involved with that too. Also later in this class, when we get into allergies, and while we won't get into it tonight, sort of associated with that would be things like autoimmune disease and histamine intolerances and things. With that, it's sort of like the adaptive system starts to go a little haywire and starts identifying a lot of things that aren't harmful as problematic. And then that can cause a lot, whether it's your own body or allergens or something else, and just is like, that's a problem. That's a problem. Raise the immune system up. Let's deal with this. Let's deal with that. Let's attack our own body, or whatever it may be. And that's when we run into some of the problems, some of the more complicated problems of immune cell dysregulation. But if it's working smoothly, it's actually quite sophisticated and a really helpful, higher evolved system, if you will. And there are a lot of reasons why it might get out of whack, and we'll get into that more when we get into the allergy class later on. Also interconnected, no, everything is interconnected, but also interconnected is your microbiome, which plays a enormous role in immune system regulation, immune system vitality, and doing some of the work by creating a less hospitable environment, kind of bumping out some of the less desirable critters, certainly in the digestive system, but also potentially throughout the body, on the skin, elsewhere. And remember too that we have those barrier systems and they're really important. And when we're looking at supporting our overall immune system, we want to also support those barriers. So the skin, just the fact that we have skin, but also there should be a little bit of an acid mantle on the skin as well as some of our microbiome that helps support us there. We also have fever response, which is sort of a non-specific but often kind of broadly useful technique. Yeah, I like to think of it as burning out the microbes. And we're not going to get into herbs to support the fever as a major part of our lecture, but I do have some extra slides and I have some info in your chart in your notes, excuse me, on herbs that might be supportive for all of that. The macrophages play a big role there. And also stomach acid. Stomach acid is really important for helping our body fend off any microbes that come in through the digestive system. So whether we eat something bad or maybe something comes in through the nose or the mouth and then we swallow that mucus and it goes into the stomach, having high stomach acid should help kill off most germs. So if we don't have sufficient stomach acid, which could be from medications, from stress, from aging, from bad diet. A lot of Americans don't have adequate stomach acid for a variety of reasons. You are potentially also more at risk of getting infections. And so like proton pump inhibitors have been shown to have a potential side effect of increasing the risk of pneumonia because, at least in part because we, aren't as able to kill off germs that come in through our digestive system. And there are some studies that are showing an association, but we don't know whether or not it's a causation of being on proton pump inhibitors and having a greater likelihood of getting COVID or having more severe outcomes, more severe infections with COVID. But there's still a lot we don't know with that. That's not necessarily a proven cause and effect, but they do seem to be not super helpful in the grand scheme of things. So that's a little bit about the immune system. There's so much more that's really, really basic, but just a little bit to get us going. And the respiratory system, of course, is so closely tied in with our immune system because, it is really what comes in contact with so many of the germs. It's just so easy for germs to break into the system, especially if everything else isn't working totally optimally, or if you just come across a really virulent germ. And we also have other things like sinusitis, bronchitis, pneumonia, asthma that can have an infectious component. I mean, asthma is not infectious, but it does seem to have a relationship with the immune system. And if you get an infection and you have asthma, you might be more likely to have a flare up of your asthma with that. So, we need in the respiratory system the right amount of mucus, and mucus is going to be coating the respiratory system as well as the digestive system and creates a little bit of a protective lining, keeps things moist, makes it a little bit harder for germs to break through, serves lots of other functions. And so we need some moisture, some mucus throughout our body to help protect us. But we don't want too much mucus because when we overproduce, and especially if our immune system is already really bogged down, it does create a prime breeding ground for pathogens to thrive. So especially bacteria and fungus can really thrive in a cold, damp, infectious state. And oftentimes those are more secondary infections where you might start off with a viral infection. Your immune system produces more mucus because it's trying to capture the viruses and block out the viruses and get them into the stomach acid or cough them out and get them out. But what can happen as time goes on is if that lingers and your immune system just isn't strong enough, you can end up with secondary infections that are more severe, like pneumonia, for example, or bronchitis or something like that, because you now have this prime breeding ground. So there's like this real balancing act with mucus. And we have a lot of herbs that support mucus, either drying it up or thinning it out, moving it, coating it, adding a little bit more of a mucus lining, different things. We have a lot of supports that we can turn to depending upon what's going on in the body. And we won't really get into that too much today, but there's just so much more to the immune system. But I do have some information in your notes and slides that you can refer to. And I do have a whole lung health class in the Beyond the Home Herbalist series. And there are links in your materials, at least there should be, because even if you're not going to take that series, I do have an older version of the audio recording of the class and the notes available for you that you can access for free through my website. So even if you don't take that class, you can go ahead and listen to it if you want to. Quick sip of tea. So why do we get sick in the first place? What is it that, when a germ is floating around, why do some people get sick and some people don't? And it was a huge breakthrough back in the day when we discovered germs in the first place. Louis Pasteur is the one who's sort of credited with the germ theory, but certainly he wasn't the only one aware of that. We know that if we look at some key historical figures in medicine and herbal medicine, like Hildegard von Bingen and Ibn Sina, that these folks, way before, centuries before Louis Pasteur's time, had also recognized that there was something kind of like what we would now call a germ that was contributing to infection, and that keeping things clean and having access to fresh air would potentially limit the spread of disease, and that there was a sort of like airborne quality to some germs and some illnesses. And we also have different communities throughout the globe that had strategies to deal with germs long before Louis Pasteur and long before antibiotics. From what I have learned from David Winston, some of the Cherokee folks had methods of creating like a sort of crude, if you will, penicillin-like substance and using that to deal with bacterial infections. And I'm sure there are many more stories like that. But, in Western medicine, we tend to give credit to Louis Pasteur. And in Louis Pasteur's time, there was this debate happening in the community of, is it the host or is it the germ? We have these germs that do seem to be the quote unquote cause of illness, but then we also know that some folks get sick and some folks don't, even if they're exposed. So is it the host's vitality or is it the germ itself? And so it was the terrain or the terroir theory was the one around the host. And supposedly on his deathbed, Pasteur said, basically that Bernard, his, terroir contemporary, was right. And the germ is nothing, the host is everything, something to that effect. So supposedly that's what he said on his deathbed. Of course, it's a little bit of both. If you're not exposed to a germ, then you're not going to get sick. But we are exposed to germs all the time. Some germs are particularly virulent, and most people will get sick with them, and you might have really severe illness with them. And some some germs are more mild. But even within that, there are always going to be some people who get sick and some people who don't, and some people who get really sick and some people who have really minor illnesses. So if we're taking a dual approach to this and we're thinking that it's both, it's the germ, but it's also the host, I think holistically, we can really work to reduce our exposure to germs to some extent. There is a value of having some exposure to germs for strengthening the immune system, as like that which does not kill you makes you stronger concept. And we can also strengthen the quality and the vitality of the host. And we can use herbs that have direct antimicrobial and immune, boosting actions. But there are also so many other ways that we can turn to herbs and holistic options to support us. So, first and foremost, we can limit our exposure to germs to at least some extent. So we can wash our hands. That's, always a good idea. Just using soap is totally fine. That will usually get rid of most germs. And we can stay home when we're sick. We can limit our exposure to other people who are sick. We can, do all the usual guidelines that we've been hearing about, like ad nauseum, especially over the last few years. We can also, sometimes some people just have that lack of resilience. Their immune system, for one reason or another, maybe they have low stomach acid, maybe they have weak immune function, maybe they're on medications, or they have a disease that literally does weaken their immune system and makes them more susceptible. Um, Maybe they, have a stronger resistance because they've had prior exposure, but different people can have different levels of vitality. And I do think we need to be careful that we don't just assume like, well, if you're getting sick, it's because your body isn't vital, which it can be a lot more complicated than that. And if your body isn't vital, then that's your fault. I don't think that that's a helpful approach personally. And there are a lot of reasons, there are certainly things that we can do to support our body's vitality. And it's great if we can do those things. But some people just come into the world with less capacity for resilience with their immune system, or they have other things going on that they have not a lot of control over, and life is complicated. So we support ourselves and each other as best we can, but I don't think that shaming anybody for the scenario that they're in is a really great approach personally. Another big area that and to support our resilience, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about now and throughout this class are going to be things that can help support us. Sleep and stress support are huge when it comes to enhancing our vitality. And when we're stressed and when we're not getting enough sleep are often when we're going to be more susceptible to germs. Sometimes we don't have total control over these things, but oftentimes we do have at least some control over prioritizing taking care of them. So, really doing as much as we can to support sleep. There is a really fascinating study that came out. And do I have it on the slide? I don't think I do. I think it might be in your notes, just so I can get the statistics right. Oh, I don't have all the details, but I think it was 6 hours that folks who got 6 hours or less of sleep per night, that compared to people who slept 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night, when they swabbed everybody in the nasal passages with active common cold rhinovirus, that the folks who got 6 hours or less of sleep per night were 3 times more likely to actually get sick from that cold. So that's a very nicely controlled situation that shows that really not getting enough sleep immediately makes you more susceptible to whatever germs are floating around. And that study was on the rhinovirus, but there are certainly other studies that have been done that are more associative versus like a proven causation with COVID that also suggests kind of a similar pattern there too. So trying to get good quality sleep, trying to, emphasize 7 to 9 hours of sleep as best we can. Sometimes you just don't sleep well or life happens. It's unfortunate that like you often don't sleep well when you're traveling, which is usually when you're going to be more exposed to germs. And so that's when you could potentially also turn to some of the herbal approaches to hopefully hedge the bets a little more in your favor in that challenging scenario. This also might be part of the reason why, one of many reasons why those adaptogens can be helpful, because of the stress support that they provide. And that may also be supporting our immune systems in some indirect ways. The stomach acid piece that I already talked about, so supporting your digestive system vitality long term would be a potential approach to supporting your immune system in general, both with dealing with common colds and flus, and also, having digestive system and microbiome balance can be really helpful when it comes to allergies and autoimmune disease and things that we'll get into more later on in the class. Vitamin D levels also seem to make us more likely, if they're low, it does seem to make us less resilient. There's still a lot we're learning about that. There's a really nice MedCram. MedCram is a YouTube podcast that's geared towards like medical students and medical providers, but he kind of looks at the science and breaks it down. It has a sort of holistic perspective. He's not that into herbs, but is into some nutrition. And so he did a really nice review recently of some research on vitamin D and COVID, and going into the explanation of why it is that when we look at folks, there's a very clear association that folks who have lower levels of vitamin D tend to have much worse outcomes, more likely to get sick, more likely to have more severe outcomes with COVID versus people with optimal vitamin D levels. But when we do studies that supplement vitamin D, the research is more mixed, and a lot of the research doesn't really show that vitamin D really helps that much. It's like, well, why is this so? And in that particular MedCram YouTube video, he went into some of the links to that it may actually be sunlight exposure that is one of the big pieces, and not just like the vitamin D levels in your bloodstream, but also being exposed to sunlight and maybe many other things that are going on with that exposure to sunlight. And in the winter months, many of us just simply don't have access to that much sunlight. And also, a lot of us work in a more indoor environment where we may have less exposure that way too. So that might be part of the reason why we tend to see worse outcomes in communities that are more indoors and more northern climates, and more during times of the year where there's just simply less sunlight available. So kind of interesting. You can still supplement with vitamin D. Unlikely to harm, might help, but it might end up being that the sunlight exposure is really where it's at. So those are a bunch of different things that we can do to support us, and things that may be playing a role in whether or not we get sick and how sick we get. But regardless of what's going on, whether there's a really virulent germ floating around, whether your immune system is less resilient for whatever reason that may be, you can still turn to immune support herbs to help bolster your system so that you have just a little bit more going in your favor. And I'm curious too, please feel free to put it in the chat box and I'll read them off in a little bit. What kinds of things you personally do in your own life that help support your own immune system? What things have been kind of your favorite go-tos, whether it's something you did all throughout your life growing up? Certainly different families have their own like go-to home remedies, and that can be cultural, and it can also just be like family to family as well. And then also what you're doing now. So feel free to share, your favorite go-tos for when, you might be coming down with something, or prevention. And of course, when we're looking at herbs and foods and natural remedies, they can be amazing. We can often use them alongside conventional medicine, even if you do end up needing or choosing to use conventional medicine too. But nothing is ever a guarantee. Nothing, conventional or otherwise, is ever a guarantee. So don't expect that this is going to give you total 100% protection. I've seen some folks who, early in the pandemic were like, well, I don't need to, this and that, because I'm just going to take my elderberry and everything will be fine. And, that's kind of a lot to expect from elderberry. Elderberry probably will be supportive, but if we can layer things, that might even be even more supportive. And there's still no guarantee. Sometimes we just get sick. That's part of life. And there are some benefits to getting sick periodically, especially when we're younger, but even just in general. But there are some benefits to having some exposure to day-to-day, not so dangerous germs in strengthening our immune systems too, which we'll get more into when we get into the allergies class. So as you're putting in your suggestions, I'm going to kind of transition, and then we'll read your tips later on towards the end. So the first thing we're going to focus on, what can we do to support the prevention and the bolstering, in the sense, of the immune system so that we're less likely to get sick. So the things that you might take throughout the whole cold and flu season, or starting a little bit before cold and flu season, or that you might just take on a daily basis. And, in the past, we only really cared about this for a few months a year. And now it's something that we're paying attention to all year round, because we've got more serious respiratory and other germs floating around all the time. And so keep in mind, nothing is ever a guarantee of total protection, but they are likely to give you a little bit more support, which is really nice. And some of these can also be utilized during an infection, whereas some of them are really more specific for that preventative phase of things. And so we'll think of it for that. So also just general prevention support basics. I was never really personally very big into, I'm not anti-vax, as you probably guessed by now, although I do understand the complexities of it. And so I'm not, I'm more moderate, I think, than some people might be on some of these topics. I was never hugely into like the flu or the pneumonia vaccine for myself personally, because I felt like my risk was relatively low and my immune system pretty decent. And so I just personally would choose not to do those particular ones for myself, but I could see why, folks who were at higher risk might choose to do those. When I first was teaching this class earlier in the pandemic, there was no vaccine out. Now there is a vaccine. It does seem to be helpful, but I will also concede that the science is showing that it's less and less helpful, but still potentially helpful from getting sick, but more importantly, from being hospitalized or having severe outcomes. Probably doesn't, the research is kind of mixed, but it seems like it probably doesn't prevent the incidence of long COVID, which is unfortunate. But, when it comes to cold and flu, we have really, well, when it comes to the cold, we have really not much that modern medicine has to offer us for like day-to-day support. And so I used to say we just didn't have anything really from modern medicine that really made a difference, that wasn't just suppressing symptoms. But I will concede that we do also have the option of vaccines, and that's going to be a personal choice for you, whether or not you choose to get vaccinated for COVID, flu, pneumonia, whatever that may be. So that's not the purpose of today's class, but I want to at least recognize that that is an option and there is evidence to support the efficacy of that to some extent. But what we're really going to focus on is all the other stuff. And these things are non-specific, so they often have benefit across a wide range of germs, which is really nice. You can certainly do these things in addition to the vaccine if you are somebody who chooses to get vaccinated. And if you choose not to get vaccinated, then I would definitely be considering these things too for additional support. So I personally am kind of like all the tools in the toolbox is how I personally work with my own life. But these are going to be choices that you personally make, and there's no one right or wrong answer. They're all complicated and imperfect, and that's just where it is. So natural things, that sleep thing, and there's my stat that I was referring to earlier. So it was 6 hours or less of sleep, which I think a lot of people sleep 6 hours or less all the time. And you can click that link if you want to actually see that particular study. And there are other studies that show similar things. Supporting nutrition. There do seem to be a lot of nutrients that help enhance the ability of the immune system to function. So having a basic multi or maybe a little bit extra on a regular basis, especially going into things, maybe there's some benefit that like, oh, I'm sick, let me now start taking vitamin D and vitamin A and zinc and selenium. And there's probably some benefit to that. But like if we could be having those things all the time in adequate amounts, not necessarily extreme, but adequate amounts, that will just kind of help our body be a little bit more replete. So it is more vital and more better able to function, less inflamed, better barrier systems and all that good stuff. So having lots of plant foods in general is very good for us. Having a very plant focused diet, whether you're eating meat or not, but having a lot of plant foods as part of your diet. Vitamin D, vitamin A. We don't want too much vitamin A, so you want to be, an adequate but not excessive amount. Vitamin C, zinc, selenium, omega-3 fatty acids. Green tea has some benefit. We'll get more into that possibly in a little bit. Having plenty of spices, mushrooms, we'll get more into. But those are just things that we should probably be having on a somewhat regular basis as long as we agree with all those things. And they're just going to give our body a little bit better ability to deal with what comes our way. So those are great. Avoiding things that tend to increase inflammation and reduce our immune system capacity. So alcohol, smoking, any other pro-inflammatory activities, washing our hands, possibly masking up and sanitizing. You could debate on that. You can debate on that. We won't go any more into that than that. Mushrooms and astragalus are potential remedies to take daily, and we're going to talk more about those. And then general immune tonics, things that are just kind of antimicrobial, warming to the body, get the circulation going, get the digestion going. They do have some direct antimicrobial activity, but they also kind of enhance our overall, like our barrier systems and everything else. So bee balm, oregano, thyme, all kind of similar. Mint family herbs, garlic, fermented foods, which particularly support the microbiome, ginger, green tea, spices, all those things are just potential nice things to have pretty regularly in our day-to-day life. And especially if it's that season, I tend to really turn to the fire cider and the pungent, veggies and my lung tea and those kinds of recipes. I just personally crave more as soon as the weather gets cool. And that's usually the perfect time to be loading up because traditionally that's when most of our infections tend to happen. Things like echinacea and elderberry, there is not a harm in taking them on a daily basis, but they tend to do their best job if you're using them like when you're likely to be exposed or at those early signs of an infection. That's when they tend to do their most benefit. So let's see, I also want to see, we've got comments and questions, so I'm going to get into that. So let me see what you folks had to say. So Hope says, my mom gave me honey mixed with lemon juice for sore throat growing up. It still helps, and I love ginger. Those are definite favorites of mine too. Kira says, my dad always made us honey and lemon juice for cough and sore throat when I was little. So yes, similar. Amy says, I love my homemade fire cider, which that's another fantastic one. Cassidy says, for prevention, sweat lodge or steam bath, ginger tea with lemon, lots of broth and chicken soup. Those all sound wonderful. And I do think, certain cultures are more attuned with that, like sweating it out, but certainly raising your body temperature especially early in an infection. So whether your fever does it or whether you do it by exposing yourself to like a little bit more heat through something like a sweat lodge or a steam bath or a sauna, there is value to that. There are studies that show that helps our body fight off an infection. And one of the ways that COVID works is it like kind of tries to tinker with the thyroid, which regulates our body temperature and metabolism, to make it so that our body can't raise our body temperature as well to have that fever response. And it may be that because for folks who, there are a lot of folks who are having like lower and lower body temperatures just as a daily thing. And that may be one of the things that makes us more susceptible to respiratory infections and infections, including COVID. So there's some interesting research we're still learning about there, but turning to, that sort of old, timey in certain cultures thing of going and sweating it out when you start to get sick, really, there's some scientific evidence to support that, which is kind of neat. And I love the broth and the soup and the hot fluids and ginger and all that. Vicky says, now I use fire cider and vitamin D. My other was a nurse, so we were raised with more traditional options such as Vicks Vapor Rub, which is definitely really classic in certain generations as well as certain cultural groups. Mother was a nurse. Okay. And then Zoe says, similar to Hope and Kira, mix of lemon, honey, cayenne, and water when they're sick. Vicky says also take astragalus daily, and Kira says, this is more of a question. Why do we not want too much vitamin A? Is it sun sensitivity? So I can't remember offhand what it is that vitamin A does, but I know that it is potentially toxic in larger amounts. Not beta carotene so much, like not vitamin A from your food, but vitamin A as like its pure substance, or whether you're getting it from liver or you're getting it especially as a supplemental form. There is a limit to that. And I'd have to do more research. The Linus Pauling Institute, lpi.org, I believe it is, but Linus Pauling Institute has really great write-ups on individual nutrients and goes into the data on like sources and what does it help with and how much should we get and what's optimal and what's, cautions and all of that. And it's interesting that a lot of the straight vitamin A supplements that you might buy are above the recommended safe amount, like not just what the baseline, but like the actual, like things could go badly if you take higher doses. Most of our separate vitamin A supplements tend to exceed those doses. So, but I would have to turn to that LPI website for detail. Maybe I can look it up real quick because I do think it's a good question. So let's see, I'm just going to look up Linus Pauling Institute. Actually, I'll do it on this computer and that way you can see me do it. So, and so this is the Macronutrient Center, but I just got right to it by Googling it. So you get all sorts of really great info, very well researched, and they love supplements. That's kind of their thing. Linus Pauling was the guy who was all about taking lots of vitamin C in his heyday, and he was a Nobel Prize winner for some other work. So let's see, safety and toxicity. Let's just jump to that. The condition caused by vitamin A toxicity is called hypervitaminosis A. It is caused by overconsumption of preformed vitamin A, not carotenoids, so not like what you would get in your vegetables and things. Preformed vitamin A is rapidly absorbed but slowly cleared from the body. Therefore, toxicity from preformed vitamin A may result acutely from high dose exposure over a short period of time or chronically from a much lower intake. Acute toxicity is relatively rare, but symptoms include nausea, headache, fatigue, loss of appetite, dizziness, dry skin, desquamentation, I don't know what that is, and cerebral edema. Dry, itchy skin, anorexia, that other word again that I don't know what it is, weight loss, headache, cerebral edema, enlarged liver, enlarged spleen, anemia, bone and joint pain, toxicity to infants, more and more liver damage in severe cases. So the tolerable upper level limit, so that's the amount that you really would not want to exceed for vitamin A for adults, is 3,000 micrograms, just what that is, RAE per day, or that equivalent of that is 10,000 IU. And a lot of our vitamin A supplements are kind of like at that or higher, so I would just be careful about that. Back to our PowerPoint. Good question, though. That's how I find out answers. I'm very good at Googling, and I know my favorite resources too. I just have a quick recipe for sanitizer in there. Immune foods are kind of my favorite thing. This is what I used to start off by talking about with this class, and I just recently kind of flipped things around a little bit. But a lot of times the foods that come into season in late summer are the foods that we really want to be eating throughout that cold and flu season to support our immune system and to just bolster our immune system. So carotenoids, which are going to be rich in anti-inflammatory properties, and beta carotene specifically, should hopefully turn into vitamin A as needed. And there's a very low risk for toxicity with beta carotene, especially if we're getting it from our food. So those like nice bright orange foods like winter squash and sweet potatoes and rutabaga and carrots. Those are great foods to be incorporating into the diet. They're also not a bad idea to incorporate into our diet in the summertime too, because if we're eating a lot of them, they actually do give us some little bit of protection against sun damage as well, which is kind of fun. Sort of the opposite of what like vitamin A topically might do, if I remember correctly. There are other carotenoids like lycopene, zeaxanthin, lutein that are kind of in the red, yellow groups of carotenoid colors, and they're also good for their own reasons, and it's not a bad thing to get a mix. And if we're getting these things from our diet, then oftentimes we are going to be getting a variety of carotenoids, and they probably do work better when they work in tandem. It's kind of true for most supplements that if we look at people who have a diet rich in nutrients, they're much less apt to have issues with diseases, chronic diseases, inflammation, cancer, heart disease, all of that. And so we'll extrapolate that and be like, oh, take beta carotene supplements, take, vitamin D supplements, take vitamin E supplements, whatever these individual supplements are. And then when we do those studies on supplementing with these isolated nutrients, they're often less impressive. Occasionally, they're even problematic. But usually they're just nowhere near as impressive as the associations that we made with those nutrient contents in people's body from their diets. And it's probably because, one, these things work better together in a more complex system like we get in food. There's more than like one constituent, and the different constituents really work in synergy. And also, like, if people have a lot of these nutrients in their diet, it probably means they're taking good care of their health and they're eating good food. And there's just a lot bigger picture of support that goes with that than trying to pigeonhole it to one specific nutrient. So with this, having a greater variety of carotenoids together will probably get even better benefit than just saying like it's all about beta carotene or it's all about lycopene or whatever it may be. Vitamin A does play a major role in supporting healthy lubrication throughout the body and supporting our ability to have healthy functioning mucous membranes. And so that protection and moistening that we get from that They also have vitamin A also has a significant impact on the vitality of our immune system in general. So having adequate amounts of vitamin A in our body, whether it's from beta carotene or from direct sources of vitamin A, is probably helpful. And not everybody does make those conversions of beta carotene to vitamin A. So that's why you do see some folks saying that you should get vitamin A from, say, cod liver oil or liver or supplement versus just relying on beta carotene rich foods. But the beta carotene rich foods are much safer. So also of note, red peppers and calendula flowers are very high in carotenoids. And of course, calendula flowers also support our lymphatic system, which gives us one of the other ways in which calendula flowers help us out. But they're great to throw into broths. Carotenoids are fat soluble, so having heat and fat involved with the process is going to extract them and make them more bioavailable. So eating them with a little fat, making them into broths, or just cooking them, you're going to get a lot better effect from that. Like raw pumpkins, okay. Cooked pumpkin with a drizzle of olive oil or something like that is even better. And the same thing is true for calendula. Calendula tea certainly does have some benefits for the lymphatic system. It's a great way to work with it. But if you want to also be getting a lot of those carotenoids, then having it in broth or some other like fat heat food will be even better for your bioavailability. Mushrooms are also fantastic for strengthening and modulating the immune system, but we are going to get into that more in just a little bit. So I'm going to leave it for that, but they are just really amazing for supporting the immune system and something we could be incorporating into our diet, and or we can be taking them supplementally. And then astragalus root is very similar in its properties. So if you're not a mushroom person, but you want somewhat similar activity, astragalus is a potential option. I should state for the record that anything that doesn't agree with you personally, then don't go there. Some people don't tolerate mushrooms. They may be allergic to them. So, don't do mushrooms. Some people may feel like their immune system actually flares up with astragalus, some folks who've previously had Lyme and some folks with autoimmune disease, not across the board though. So if you seem to do well with them, then they're probably fine and likely helpful. But if it seems like you feel worse, then listen to your body and, don't take them anymore. So definitely, no one herb or mushroom is right for everybody. Fermented foods are supportive for the microbiome and may also have some immunoregulatory activity, especially when we're taking them long term. I particularly think of them for allergy support and autoimmune support, but they do potentially play a role with just supporting your day-to-day immune system as well. So some of my favorite forms are fermented vegetables, miso soup, as long as you tolerate, traditional miso has soy and gluten in it, but you can very easily get gluten-free miso that's made with rice instead of barley. And with a little bit of searching, you can also get soy-free miso that's made with chickpeas. South something or other, South River or something or other makes a really nice chickpea gluten-free miso. But it depends, and if you tolerate gluten and soy, then you could just do regular miso. Kefir, yogurt, as long as you tolerate dairy, which isn't my favorite substance when it comes to immune support, water kefir, and possibly kombucha. I have mixed feelings about kombucha, but if it's something that seems to agree with you, then it is a good potential support there. And they are better not cooked because if you heat them, you can kill the good bacteria. Green leafies, rich in nutrients, some of that vitamin A in the form of beta carotene, other carotenoids, lutein, and just they're really nutrient dense. So they're great. Nuts, seeds, fatty fish, and oils can all be great for supporting a reduced inflammation and also healthy mucous membranes. And also just helping us when we're like dry in wintertime. Like we really don't want to be dry. It's going to make us a little bit more susceptible to those germs. And so supporting good barriers with healthy oils inside and out can be really helpful. And vitamin D can potentially also be in with them. Those pungent, like the things that we put in fire cider are really great. So onions, garlic, ginger, cayenne, horseradish, these movers, they are shakers. They help support the fever response. They help break up mucus. They reduce inflammation. They keep the circulation going. They help thin the blood. They can get, snot to drain out of your sinuses. Each one has its own sort of specialties, but they're great to be incorporating into the diet regularly and then really like amping up on when you're starting to come down with something, as long as they agree with you. I have folks that I know that have a lot of GI upset, and like ginger is just too spicy for them. It bothers their reflux, it bothers gastritis or whatever they may have going on. So in that case, they're just going to have to find other options that agree with them versus, making a flare up of something else just for the sake of having ginger. But if ginger is something that agrees with you, it's such a simple, great herb that most people have access to in their kitchens at all times. Fresh is even better, but dry does have some benefit as well. But fresh is a little bit more directly antimicrobial. Fire cider, which was sort of mentioned in passing in our vinegar class in the last class, but I'm pretty sure I have recipes in your notes in this class too. But fire cider is a great way to get those pungent herbs in an easy to take regular basis. So you just basically make a vinegar or a vinegar and honey base with all those pungent, spicy vegetables and whatever else you want to throw in there. I've had some people who throw in citrus, some people who throw in hibiscus, some people who throw in spices, whatever you want to put in there, but I usually keep it to the basics for the most part. For myself, I do like to add some turmeric and maybe cinnamon and lemongrass to mine personally. And then I like to make mine into salad dressing in the wintertime, but a lot of people just take it straight. For me and my stomach, I can't really take like whole straight like shot glasses or spoonfuls of fire cider. It's just a little too much spice and sour for my digestive system, but I can incorporate it into my foods, and that's fine. And other folks can just take it by the shot glass or the spoonful, and it works great for them that way. Amy says, I add rosemary to my fire cider. That is another one. And there is some cool research coming out on rosemary. I think it's mostly still sort of theoretical and lab-based stuff, but also suggesting some benefit for COVID, for that early exposure, that it may have some inhibitory effects on those ACE2 binding site receptor-y things when it comes to COVID breaking into our cells, which is kind of cool. But also rosemary is aromatic and anti-inflammatory and circulatory. So regardless of the germ, rosemary makes fantastic sense in fire cider. We have a question. Do you just add honey to taste or a specific ratio? It depends. Honey does make it more palatable, and it does take the edge off of some of that sour and spice that might make it a little bit more tolerable to people. So some folks do like 30% honey, 50% honey would be kind of high, but you could do it. To taste would be fine. For years, I made fire cider without any honey at all, and then sometimes I add it because it does taste a little better. Sometimes I don't add it at all, and then I'll just, sweeten as I need to when I'm making a recipe. So it's fine with it or without it, but you can play around and see what works for you. There is, of course, therapeutic benefit to honey from the perspective of soothing sore throat, coughs, and possibly also, if it's raw honey, having some benefits for allergies. That's debatable, but unlikely to be harmful as long as you tolerate the sugar. Amy says, I think Rosemary Gladstar's recipe is public, and that's what I base all my variants on it. Yes, you can definitely get Rosemary's recipe online. I think she just says honey to taste, but I can't remember for sure. I learned it from Rosemary when I was in herb school myself. Lots of room for flexibility, and Rosemary says that herself, like take the recipe, make it your own, and do what works for you. Well, my slides are switching. Vitamin C rich foods. There's a lot of debate on like how much vitamin C, can you get adequate amounts of vitamin C from food? Certainly, at least modest amounts of vitamin C are going to be really important for helping to support connective tissue vitality, as well as to support immune system function. And we're not super likely nowadays, with ready access to fresh foods at all times in the grocery store, to be totally deficient in vitamin C. But having slightly larger doses might have some immune supportive and antihistamine-like activities. And then there are additional, like more drug-like activities that vitamin C may have when it is injected in a doctor's office, which is not an at-home environment. And you can get much higher levels in the bloodstream with an injection. So like a IV transfusion is what I mean. So it's a whole other thing. There does seem to be value in a lot of different more severe disease processes with IV vitamin C, but that's not an at-home thing. It's not really something herbalists are doing. So it's not my personal focus, but just, vitamin C from the diet, vitamin C supplements potentially. If you get too much vitamin C, usually your body is just going to get diarrhea and get it out that way. So it's not really like a harm of taking too much, but if you start to get loose stools, then you can probably back off your dose because you're probably taking more than your body is capable of absorbing orally at that point. Food sources always have bioflavonoids in the matrix, and bioflavonoids are going to help the vitamin C work more effectively and provide their own immune supportive, anti-inflammatory, antihistamine actions. So they're great to incorporate. So rose hips, especially fresh, especially as like a jam or syrup. The dried is okay, but vitamin C gets lost pretty quickly once things are dried or cooked or stored. So having things in their fresh forms is really the best. So food, citrus is a really great format. We called sailors lineys because we discovered that as people were getting scurvy and getting really sick on these continental journeys, that they were becoming deficient in vitamin C. They didn't know exactly what it was going on at the time, but they did figure out eventually that limes, they would store well and they would seem to provide enough of whatever folks needed, which was vitamin C and bioflavonoids, to keep them from dying of scurvy and root. Also, evergreen trees, any of our safe to consume evergreen trees like white pine and hemlock needle. So hemlock evergreen, not poison hemlock, but hemlock evergreen tree, and some other evergreens that are safe to consume, fir, spruces. You could make teas or eat them, and they do also provide a lot of vitamin C and bioflavonoids, or a modest amount of vitamin C and a lot of bioflavonoids, and can be enough to stave off scurvy. And so there's a story of Jacques Cartier and his crew traveling across Canada, and one of the indigenous communities recognized that the explorers were developing scurvy and cured them by giving them evergreen needle tea, which at the time the explorers thought was Thuja occidentalis or arborvitae. And so they named it arborvitae, tree of life, and they started exporting it back to the old world as one of the first trees. We're thinking now that it was probably white pine that the indigenous community was sharing and not Thuja, but again, there's some debate there. But I do think it's interesting. Thuja does have some safety concerns with consuming it regularly, whereas white pine would be pretty safe to consume on a regular basis and would have a whole host of additional immune supportive benefits as well. I have a little extra bonus slide on white pine in the slides. I think some of the hype around it I don't know that I buy some of the current hype around it, but there's certainly not a lot of evidence to support it, but maybe there's value there. But certainly white pine makes sense as being anti-inflammatory, circulatory supportive, vitamin C, bioflavonoids. White pine does make sense. It's aromatic, so lots of benefits there. And it's a vitamin C source in wintertime. Green and white tea also have value, also black tea for that matter. So the true tea, Camellia sinensis. There is a variety of research that suggests that drinking green tea or gargling with green tea, that they both have some antiviral properties against the cold and flu. And it's not really like my big go-to of like drink lots of green tea to fight an infection. But if it's something that agrees with you and it's something that makes you feel better, having green, black, or white tea with lemon and maybe a little honey is sort of a classic soothing remedy when you're getting sick. And there may actually be some value. So having it on a regular basis or having it as you're getting sick does seem to potentially have some value. If it's too much caffeine though, you could try decaf, or you may find that you just need to try a different remedy altogether. And holy basil would be a great consideration with this because holy basil, it's not our go-to, but holy basil is actually a great immune supportive herb, and it's aromatic, it's immunomodulatory, it is directly antimicrobial to some extent, and it would be a great companion for green tea as a beverage. And in fact, I have a little bit of holy basil and lemon balm and lemongrass tea over here that I can sip as well. I'm not sick as far as I'm aware, but I do like my teas. Let's see, we have a comment. So I froze my rose hips first year harvesting them. Do you know what I could do with them and if they will still be vitamin C rich? So I don't know offhand how quickly vitamin C is lost in the freezer offhand. I'd have to research that. But it's probably one of the better ways to preserve it. And then what you can do, I have not done rose hip recipes personally because there are hairs in the middle that are kind of annoying to work with. But one thing that you could do with it is you could just gently make a syrup with like as minimal heat as possible, strain it through a jelly bag or something like that. You want to get all those little irritating hairs out. The seeds aren't really problematic, but it's hard to strain it without losing the seeds as well. And then you can take that as a jam or a syrup, and that does seem to retain the vitamin C a little bit better than other recipes do. So you can try that out. There might be recipes online. Like I said, I've never actually done it, so I'm not probably the best person to get advice from on what to do with your rose hips. I mostly use my roses for the flowers, and then I buy rose hips because I'm lazy and busy. So let's see, it's 7:10. Do you folks want a break now, or do you want me to cover some herbs and then take a break? Keep going. Okay, cool. I will keep going. Then we'll cover at least the mushrooms and we'll see how far we can get. And then we'll take a break a little after 7:30. So basic immune support. So things that are going to support our deep immune system. So these are things that we can use for prevention. There are also herbs and mushrooms and things that may be useful post-infection and during convalescence. Sometimes they're also fine to take during an infection too, but usually they're most specific for like having on a regular basis, especially if you know that your immune system just isn't quite up to snuff and you want to support it a little bit more, and or post-infection just to help with that convalescence and the healing process. And some of them may also be helpful with scenarios like long COVID, chronic Lyme, those kinds of more challenging post-infectious states. So lots of options. I have a picture of elderberry, but really it's not elderberry that we're talking about just yet. So mushrooms are amazing. I'd love to hear your mushroom stories in the chat box if you want to share them. But mushrooms do a lot of things for us as food and medicine. And so they are a great thing to incorporate on a daily or near daily basis if you want to be supporting your immune system, whether you're incorporating them in your diet, you're taking them in supplemental form, or you're doing both those things. So one of the big things that mushrooms tend to do is be immunomodulatory. And this goes mainly to the specific set of constituents called polysaccharides. So these are complex starches, poly for many and saccharide for like starchy, sugary thing. They're not sugar, they're more of a complex starch than that. And specifically the type of polysaccharide that we really tend to focus on are the glucans. And then within the glucan group, beta glucans tends to be, what we really often focus on. And there are many different glucans and beta glucans and polysaccharides in different mushrooms that seem to be helpful. So how they seem to work in the body is that when your immune system comes into contact with these polysaccharides, it almost sort of thinks that it's an intruder, that it's almost like, hey, wait, like, I don't know if you belong here. Let's mount a little bit of an immune response to you. And you would think that that would be a bad thing, but almost always it turns out to be a good thing. It usually has an effect on modulating the immune system so that the immune system just simply functions better. It's better able to handle infections when they come its way. It's less likely to go into overreactive states in examples of like autoimmune disease and allergies. The mushrooms are often really helpful in people dealing with things like long COVID and chronic Lyme, and helping to regulate the sort of autoimmune like qualities that tend to happen in those. So really like has a lot of potential right there, and seems to be helpful for respiratory infections, cancer, and all those other things I just mentioned. So I like to think of mushrooms as sending your immune system back to boot camp. And it seems to help the cells communicate better because the immune system is very complicated. There are a lot of different fronts of the immune system and a lot of different compounds within the immune system. And we require a little bit of inflammation in order for the immune system to function properly. Like when the immune system is fighting something, inflammation is part of that, and it's supposed to be part of that, but we don't want that inflammation to get out of hand. And so we have this kind of dance that we're doing, and the mushrooms and the polysaccharides really seem to do a fantastic job helping that signaling, the function, the strength, the quality. So the immune system doesn't, it can do what it needs to do and can fight its battle well, but at the same time, it's not going to get itchy trigger finger and start to fight with things that are not problematic. Which you think of if you've got like an army that's like sort of half-heartedly trained and it doesn't really have to deal with too much. It's not getting much, many drills going on. And then like, somebody just runs across the street and like there's a big shootout because it was something crazy. If you're a fan of 80s music and you listen to the song 99 Red Balloons or 99 Luftballons, it is about the Cold War. But if you listen to it from the mindset of thinking about autoimmune disease and allergies and an itchy trigger finger immune system, it is exactly what can happen in that, wayward immune system. So I urge you to listen to that song again and think of it in terms of, overreactive immune system. So having about 1/8 to 1/4 cups of the equivalent of a raw volume, but you're going to want to ultimately cook them, of any mushroom consumed daily in one study had a 45% lower risk of all types of cancers, including breast cancer, which is not exactly our topic for today, but I think it's kind of cool. And so these are things you want to be consuming very regularly, especially leading up to and during the main infectious time period, but you could also just have them all year long. They do make vitamin D, which is kind of cool. They make vitamin D2, which is the less bioavailable, usable form, but it is still vitamin D. So there may be some value there. And so mushrooms are not plants. They're more like animals than either of us are like plants. And they make vitamin D in the sun, much like we do when we're exposed. And if you turn them upside down where the sun doesn't normally shine, they're even more apt to make that vitamin D and get kind of like a sunburn, if you will, and make a lot of vitamin D. And then you can dehydrate them and you can consume them. And so in one study that Paul Stamets did, 3 ounces of shiitake mushrooms put out in the sun for 6 hours turned the vitamin D content from just 110 IUs, which is okay, but nothing amazing, to 46,000 IU of vitamin D2 in that original 3 ounces of shiitake, which was huge. And they retained a good amount of that for up to a whole year in storage, which was also pretty neat. Mushrooms also have fiber, they have minerals, they have protein, so they have a lot going for them. And you do always want to cook or simmer your fruiting body mushroom. So what we think of as a mushroom is the fruiting body, and that really should be cooked for a couple different reasons. The big one is that the matrix of a whole mushroom fruity body is it's got chitin in it, which is a really tough type of fiber. It's the same kind of fiber that shellfish use to make their shells. So if you think of how tough like a lobster shell is, that's kind of like something that's sort of interwoven throughout the mushroom fruiting body. And so you need to simmer them on a low like water extract in order to just break down that chitin so that you can even get access to the polysaccharides and the beta glucans and all the other benefits. So that's one thing right there. Also, many mushrooms that are otherwise safe, if you have them raw, they actually do contain some irritating and mildly toxic constituents that once you cook them, they're safer. Now, I want to clarify though, because occasionally students mishear me and misunderstand me on this, that if you have a poisonous mushroom, Cooking it does not make it safe. You can still die. If you cook a poisonous mushroom, it could kill you. It could even taste great and still kill you within a pretty short period of time. So we're only talking about safe mushrooms, but safe mushrooms are safer and more bioavailable when you cook them. So this is for the mushroom fruiting body. You can take raw mycelium, which is like that white stuff that you see. It's sort of like, if you could think of like the roots in a sense of the mushroom, and then the fruiting body is kind of like the flowering plant of the mushroom. But you can eat the mycelium in a more raw state because it doesn't have the chitin in it, and usually that is okay. So a lot of our supplements are actually the mycelium. They might not be quite as potent as the fruiting bodies, but they are cheaper and easier to make, and they do seem to have some health benefits. So a lot of the companies in the United States that sell mushroom products are actually using the mycelium as opposed to the fruiting body. But the fruiting bodies are what are primarily traditionally used in, for example, traditional Asian medicines and Russian medicine and other sort of like Northern European, Western European medicines as well, communities that have a very long history of mushrooms. And I apologize if you can hear my dog is having nightmares in the next room. So I apologize if you can hear whining in the background. She's a rescue. So I don't know what she dreams about, but I don't think it's pleasant. Let's see. You can make a bunch of different remedies. It's just trickier to make mushroom remedies. So just powdering up mushrooms is like a fruiting body mushroom is not likely to have a whole lot of benefit. It's just not likely to do a whole lot. You might get other constituents from it, but you're not really going to get so much of the beta glucans. So doing a gentle decoction, simmering it, gently simmering it in broth, cooking it, sauteing them and eating them, having them in food. You can, if you powder them and then you heat them to make medicine, it's even better. You get even more bioavailability from it. You can do the mycelium powders. You can make double extraction tinctures where you like basically are doing a concentrated decoction. You're simmering it in water, and then you're also then adding alcohol. There are a couple of different ways to do it. There's a whole blog on my website, but you can do those. You can do concentrated syrups. But like just a basic tincture for most mushrooms is probably not going to do that much. And the polysaccharides they're repelled by alcohol and they're destroyed by alcohol. So if you're mainly going for those polysaccharides, you're probably not going to get much from them in a tincture. But if you do a decoction or double extraction tincture and a low percent alcohol, you can still get some benefit, and you'll get other constituents that might be in those mushrooms as well. Let's see. Do I have a favorite mushroom for soups? I do. I will get into them. Specifics for each season, that I'm not quite sure about. So if you could elaborate on what you mean by that. I'm not going to get into all the mushroom background, but I do have some extra slides. I just talked to you about a little bit of the recipes. There is a fun way to do tea powder. Christopher Hobbs goes into detail in his mushroom book. The new one that just came out is really, really awesome. And that's Christopher Hobbs. But what he'll do is he'll make like a tea and then concentrate it down and then dehydrate it. He'll blend it into a sludge, and then he'll dehydrate it and then powder that. And then you can just take that as is. And so you get like this concentrated water extract that's been dehydrated and the cooked mushroom all together, all powdered up. That's a really great way to use it too. It's just a little bit time consuming. What's next? So lots of great medicinal mushrooms to choose from. Some of them, I tend to only work with the really common ones. And so shiitake is my favorite for adding to foods. I get the dried shiitake and then I powder it up and then I sprinkle it in broth and food and casseroles and whatever I feel like. Maitake is nice. I personally prefer maitake fresh, and then I'll saute it to cook it. I don't personally like the way it tastes once it's been dried, but I love it when it's good quality fresh if you have access to it from a fresh mushroom grower, or if you are good at foraging. Reishi mushroom is like all that in a bag of chips mushroom, and that it's so awesome. It has so many different types of constituents that are beneficial for our immune systems, but it is a little bit bitter and it's very tough. It's like, you know, like wood. So it's not something you're gonna chop up and eat. So I'll show you. Let me just move my chat box so I can see. So this is one of our types of reishi mushroom. This one over here, I think is artist conch, if I remember correctly, which is another Ganoderma species. This is a reishi slice right here. We've got our shiitakes. Get rid of my camera for the video. So we've got, oops, shiitakes up here, really, really yummy and delicious, and one of the most, after button mushrooms and portobellos and crimini mushrooms are all the same species of mushroom. After those, shiitakes are the most widely available, and they do pack a little bit more medicinal punch than those button mushrooms and crimini and portobellos. However, as long as they're cooked, those classic cooking, culinary mushrooms are still good for you too. This is our maitake, but this is sort of a sad looking maitake that we had access to that day. Turkey tails has some of the most research around cancer and the most human research around cancer, and they're very common medicinal mushrooms that you can forage for, and they're pretty easy to cultivate as well. So they're a fun one to learn about, especially when it comes to the anti-cancer piece, but probably helpful for bolstering our general immune system. I'm using less chaga these days. I almost don't use it at all just because I'm concerned about the sustainability of it, amongst other things. But a lot of people do like it. There is some value, but I'm using it less for sustainability. And then there's a lion's mane hiding under here. Those are a few. Any safe edible mushroom is fine. I have some general cautions here. I would be cautious if somebody was on like immunosuppressive, immunoregulatory meds. I just don't know if they would be a problem with that. And then there are people who have mushroom allergies, or if you're somebody who has FODMAP sensitivities, where you're sensitive to complex starchy foods like gluten, dairy, which have a lot of different reasons why people may not tolerate them, but also garlic, onions, chickpeas. Those are some examples of some high FODMAP foods, chicory, inulin. If those things make you really gassy and bloated, you may also find medicinal mushrooms irritating or not. I mean, you can always check to see. There's lower risk with a double extraction tincture, but still some risk. So you'd have to listen to your body on that one. So I have just some extra info. So reishi I do want to mention because reishi is a really stellar mushroom when we talk about the immune system because it does a lot of different things. It has those beta glucans in it, and it's pretty potent for that. But it also is really rich on terpenes, which you will get more of if you make like a tea or a tincture, the double extraction tincture. You'll get more of those terpenes, and those have anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory effects. And it's a little bit of like a sort of adaptogen. It's gently energizing. It has some cardiovascular support, some liver support. It's like a little bit blood thinning, which is most cases pretty good, but it's also a profound tonic for the lungs, and long-term use seems to improve mitochondrial function, which is cellular energy, as well as respiratory function, oxygen utilization, and support longevity. This is the mushroom of immortality, and so which is why I named my dog after it. And so just a really great mushroom to consider, especially when we're talking about allergies, autoimmune disease, long illness, post-illness sequelae like long COVID and chronic Lyme. Reishi would be a great mushroom to consider for those things. So that's just a little aside. And I've just clicked some extra little slides on things like shiitake and turkey tails. Cordyceps also has value. It's another mushroom that seems to have some adaptogenic properties and energizing. It's more energizing than reishi, generally speaking, but different people and different products have different levels of energizing effect. And it seems to also have an affinity for the lungs and oxygen utilization and mitochondrial function and all of that. And I did see a comment that mentioned cordyceps, so I wanted to read that with this. So Vicky says, I made a tincture for my spouse that uses cordyceps for increased energy, like adaptogen, and I forget what the other herbs were in that tincture. Do you know if cordyceps can assist the immune system? Yes, definitely. Cordyceps does have value for the immune system, and it does also have that sort of lung supportive and that energy supportive action as well. So I tend to turn to it more if I need those extra things. It's kind of expensive. The quality really does vary quite a bit on the market. It's traditionally in Asia made, it's a fungus that affects caterpillars, but we nowadays in the United States are usually using a lab cultivated uh, cordyceps. Usually it's actually the cordyceps militaris that we're using, which does seem to have benefits as well. So you could be using it for day-to-day immune system support, but I would particularly consider it for folks who had respiratory weakness and for whom that increased energy seemed to be agreeable for them. So a lot of times I'll look for products that have reishi and cordyceps for supporting folks who have COPD or chronic, frequently get pneumonia, might suggest that they take a product throughout the season, or other scenario, maybe they have like a long COVID or a chronic Lyme. Cordyceps is something that's often turned to for those. But just for like the day-to-day immune system stuff for most people, I tend to think more of things like shiitake and maitake and the regular culinary mushrooms and reishi and turkey tail. And they're much more economical and readily available too. Oyster mushrooms, lion's mane's very good nerve tonic. Lion's mane's really, it does all the other mushroom stuff too, but then it's also really great for helping the nerves heal from damage. So we tend to think of it more for cognition and nerve damage and those kinds of things, which we are seeing post-infection sometimes. So lion's mane would definitely be worth considering for that. So astragalus, I also want to mention, has sort of similar properties. It's also rich in polysaccharides. It's also sort of an immune, it's not really an adaptogen because it's not working at least so directly on the stress and adrenal systems, but it's kind of like an adaptogen for the immune system where it has this modulatory effect, and it's most specific for either prevention or like later for rebuilding, and less appropriate during the infection. And not to say that you could never do it, but just the traditional use of it is usually not as appropriate and good of a fit during that time frame. Generally really well tolerated. I think that it's actually generally helpful for folks who have autoimmune disease, but there are some people who do feel like they get flared up from it. So if you do notice that you have any problems with astragalus, then certainly turn to something else. But it is generally considered a pretty safe food-like immune bolstering herb, and it's also rich in polysaccharides, kind of like the mushrooms, but it's not a mushroom, it's a legume family root. So if you can't do mushrooms, astragalus might be nice, and it's it's pleasant enough flavor that it's really easy to mix it in recipes. And because it doesn't have that tough chitin wall, you don't like have to cook it so much in order to get the benefits from it. So you could do a powder or tincture, but nonetheless, polysaccharides do really like hot water extracts are kind of one of the things that polysaccharides like most, but you don't have to do that in order to access the medicine. So lots of benefit there, and they taste good. They're kind of sweet and woodsy, and they're a nice general tonic. They're a little bit moistening in a way, a little bit warming. So as long as you tolerate them, they can be helpful. And then just a little shout out to those respiratory and immune adaptogens. So here's a quick list of mostly adaptogenic herbs. Lemon balm is not really an adaptogen, but I threw it in there, that have immune tonic, respiratory benefits, immunoregulatory benefits, and they also have some benefit for like stress, energy, adaptogen. Lemon balm's more of a nervine. So ashwagandha, holy basil, lemon balm, which probably has some antiviral effects, Cotinopsis, Schizandra, Rhodiola, Eleuthero, those also all still have potential benefit for really like any of these stages, but particularly in that preventative and or like post-infectious sequelae stages, you could definitely be considering those for additional support. And each one's a little different, so you'll want to figure out which one is right for you. And my chat box is over my over my little like cues for questions. So you can be thinking about, we're not going to go into all of them because I don't have time in today's class to go into all the little questions, but they're good things to be thinking about. Like, Have you used them? Have you shown, seen benefits with some of these herbs? So this seems like a good spot for us to take our break. So we'll take about 10 minutes. It is about 7:35. And so we'll come back at 7:45. We'll talk about our more direct immune bolstering herbs, and then we'll make our remedies, and then we will talk about allergies in our last little bit. So I will see you in about 10 minutes. Okay, so we're back to talk a little bit more about the immune system. And so these are the things that you might think about doing in those early signs of when you're starting to notice that little tickle. You're like, oh no, I'm catching something. Or if you know you're more likely to be susceptible. So, maybe you're traveling and you know that by traveling, you're more likely to be susceptible. Maybe you're going to a gathering with lots of other people. Because, for me personally, I catch things pretty easily, probably because one, I'm just kind of a weaker constitution. I have less original chi. I don't know. Maybe it's because I was a preemie. Maybe it's because I have Hashimoto's. Who knows? But I do catch things pretty easily, and I get knocked down pretty easily. So some people just have a tendency. But Shannon also, we don't have kids. We don't interact with kids that often. And so when we go to parties and you get kids and you get sick kids, like we often catch whatever germs are floating around at those family parties. And this was pre-pandemic. So now we know that when we're going into parties, we load up on our elderberry and our echinacea and our ginger. And oftentimes that seems to help us avoid that post family party getting sick. And not always, but oftentimes. Or if I'm just traveling in general, air travel, I will probably still wear a mask this time around when I travel in the air, just for what it's worth, even though I won't be wearing a mask in restaurants and other places, but just, limiting my exposure. But definitely those kinds of places, it's just really easy to catch germs. And when you're all cooped up with other people traveling from different places who are likely to also be sick, and you might be stressed and run down and not sleeping well and all of that. So, or you're just, you got a bad night's sleep and it's cold and flu season. So anytime you're just in a weakened state, maybe you're somebody who oftentimes gets sick or is in a weakened state just before you get your period, there is a drop of immune function when both estrogen and progesterone are low. And so oftentimes people will find that in that sort of premenstrual time period, they are more likely to have all sorts of different problems. It's like the world falls apart, not just your mood and cramps and migraines, but you might also be more susceptible elsewhere. So really taking that time to focus on sleep and immune support and vitamins and all that might be enough to help you get over those potential hurdles and exposures with less damage, or, totally fine. So all the basic things that we've already talked about are even more important in those times when you're starting to get sick or you're being exposed. So rest and sleep are hugely important, especially if you're starting to get sick. There is also a place for some movement. So especially with COVID, it does seem like, if you're just lying down or if you're having any kind of chest congestion, rest is still really important, but moving around will help move that mucus a little better too. So interspersing that rest with some amount of movement so that the congestion isn't just sitting in your head or sitting in your chest, and your blood isn't like getting stagnant from laying down the whole time. But lots of rest nonetheless, because that's when your body's going to be able to do the most healing if you're not putting a lot of other work on your body. Sleep, making sure you're getting plenty of sleep, plenty of fluids, particularly hot fluids, and all, broth, tea, soup, water, all that good stuff. All the things we already talked about, really increasing those. Mushrooms may be helpful, pungent herbs, green tea, oregano, rosemary, bee balm, maybe inhaling some of those as you're steeping your tea to get the steam. Skip the astragalus, that's less specific and maybe not even very helpful in this particular stage. Really hitting elderberry and echinacea hard. So almost all your remedies that you might be taking at this time frame, if you're starting to get sick, you want to be like, every couple hours, every hour, just really like pumping them into your system. And that tends to work better than just saying like, oh, I just took it once. That might work if it's just a daily routine or whatever. But if you're starting to feel something, like you're really going to want to hit it hard. Or if you know you're just in a really high likelihood area, like traveling or whatever, you might be taking more regular remedies. I'll often take like a 2 or 4 ounce bottle of echinacea, and I'll just kind of sip from it throughout. You can only bring 3 ounces at a time, TSA. So usually I'll bring like a bottle in my purse and then another bottle in my checked baggage, and do it that way. And I'll just kind of sip it for a day or two, and I'm usually done with the bottle pretty quickly in that acute state. You do look a little bit like a closet, like you have alcohol stuff going on when you're sipping from little nip bottles from your purse, but who cares? It's for your immune system. There are lots of other options like andrographis and umca that I don't personally work with that much, but there is a bit of research on them if you want to look into them more. And then all the common sense, I'm not going to get into this. You can refer back to it, but if you might have COVID or you do have COVID, you definitely want to watch for any more severe symptoms that might indicate that medical care really is absolutely necessary and preferred. So you can look over that list at your own leisure. And echinacea. So echinacea is a really classic one. It's sort of a gateway herb for a lot of folks. And it does seem to do a lot of different things to support the immune system. And mostly I think of it as an immune mobilizer, that it's basically like turning on those white blood cells, really getting the immune system, out and ready for battle, putting those guns in their hands and sending them out to go say, fight that battle. And it does more than just that, but that's really sort of a simplified way of thinking about when is one of the best times to take echinacea. And that is definitely one of the best times to take it, is early on, to say, okay, immune system, go do your thing and get this happening. But it does a lot of things too. It is also a lymph mover. So we've talked a little bit about calendula and other herbs moving the lymph. Echinacea is one of our classic herbs that helps move the lymph, clear out the lymph, support lymph detoxification, which includes that debris from that battle, which is part of what makes us feel cruddy when we're sick, and part of what bogs down our body is just all that battle debris. And echinacea does help move that along, and it would be a great consideration if you were having like swollen lymph nodes. Now you could also incorporate other lymph herbs too, like I know one of you shared a story earlier about having a pretty severe swollen lymph node and drinking like a really strong calendula tea for a couple of days, and that lymph node just totally like went back to normal pretty quickly, and that the doctor was impressed. So calendula is a great lymph mover as well. It's not as much of the immune mobilizer, but it's a great lymph mover. Red root, another really classic lymph mover. So especially we would think of those when the lymph seems really like bogged down, or when your lymph nodes are starting to get swollen when you're sick. You could do echinacea, but you could also combine it with other lymph moving herbs, or especially if echinacea was not an appropriate choice for you personally, you might turn to some of those other lymph moving herbs instead of echinacea for that piece of things. The quantity of echinacea, so if you're using it in that like I'm getting sick kind of mood, or I'm really on like high alert for potentially getting sick, you'd want to be taking it every couple hours at least, as often as you think about it, really, in relatively high doses. So like if the tincture, you might be using anywhere from a half teaspoon to a teaspoon of tincture a couple times a day. That could be a bit of alcohol, so that may not always be appropriate for everybody. Gaia makes some really nice phyto capsules that are pretty strong, and so that's what I personally tend to like to take, just because I don't like the taste of echinacea. It makes your tongue feel all weird, and I don't know, I just don't really like it. So even though I do make my own echinacea tincture and I use it sometimes, and tincture is one of the most effective ways to use it, I've ended up turning to the Gaia capsules, but they are kind of expensive. So that's a downside. They are alcohol free though. The root is stronger, but the leaves and the aerial parts do have benefits as well. So a lot of companies do a combo of them. And when I tincture them, I'll tincture the flowers and the leaves when they're happy and vital, and then I'll tincture the root in the fall. And then sometimes I'll combine the two together when I'm taking them. Echinacea does a lot of other things for the immune system as well. It's also anti-hyaluronidase, which is like, what the heck does that mean? So hyaluronic acid is a sort of like a sticky, gluey substance that's in your joints and it's in a lot of places. But one of the things that it does is it helps protect the cells from viruses breaking in. Because one of the ways that viruses work is they have to break into a cell, adhere to it, basically bind to a receptor site, and then they go into the cell, they sort of reprogram your cells to make more viruses, and then those viruses kind of explode out of the cell, destroying that cell, causing some damage from that, and then spreading and getting more and more virulent throughout the body. And that's sort of this like horror movie, alien movie monster way that viruses work in the body. And echinacea seems to work, besides just mobilizing the immune system to fight it and helping the lymphatic system clear things out, it also seems to help inhibit the enzyme that those viruses and possibly bacteria too are exuding. They have this hyaluronidase, which is an enzyme that breaks down that hyaluronic acid to help it like get into the cells. And echinacea actually seems to inhibit that enzyme and make it so that the viruses are not as able to break into the cell, sort of like neutralizes them a little bit. And so that may or may not have much of an effect systemically, like when you swallow echinacea, is it getting to, different places. But if you're spraying a throat spray and the viruses are getting in, through your throat, the cells in your throat, that would be a great application for echinacea in that kind of way. And maybe or maybe not that it has an effect systemically for that. It does also have some direct antimicrobial, not just antiviral, but antibacterial effects internally, systemically. And it has a much longer history of use for dealing with bacterial infections, sepsis, those kinds of things, and helping the body like through supporting the immune system function, as well as help clearing out all that waste and gunk in the body. It tends to be really good for that. Now, sepsis is life-threatening, and nowadays we do have access to medical care. So if you have sepsis, it would be wise to go seek medical interventions, but there is that tradition of use there. And I will say too that it's also great for mouth infections. And during the pandemic, just before, I had some inappropriate, poorly diagnosed dental infections that got diagnosed just as we were getting into the shutdown. And so I wasn't able to get proper medical care for them immediately, and they really blew up. But I was able to keep them at bay before I got the proper diagnosis, and then afterwards with really high doses of echinacea capsules. And it kept it at bay really well until I needed to go into surgery just as things were reopening for something else, and I had to go off the echinacea for a week, and then they really blew up, and I went on multiple courses of different kinds of antibiotics that did not touch it. The echinacea was definitely vastly better for managing it, even if it wasn't able to get rid of it. I needed 2 root canals, and it took almost 20 dentist appointments to finally resolve all of that. But in that year of saga, echinacea probably kept me out of the hospital, because I otherwise would have had a antibiotic resistant, really severe dental infection. And there was no question for myself and for my endodontist that the echinacea was at least keeping it at bay, and it definitely decreased the inflammation and the pain as well. Echinacea is also anti-inflammatory. It does have immunomodulatory activity as well. So I don't tend to think of it as much in that way, but there are polysaccharides in echinacea root, and it does have some immunoregulatory action as well. So it does have a potential place for daily use, but unless there was some other reason for you to be using it daily, it's safe to take daily, but unless there was some other reason to be using it daily, I would generally reserve echinacea for that, like when you're starting to get sick or you think you might be exposed, and then throughout the course of the infection until it's pretty much resolved, and then you can gradually wean off on that. There are some people who have allergic reactions to the daisy-like flowers. Less of an issue with the tincture, and even less of an issue with the tinctured root, but it is possible. It does make your tongue go numb. That's normal. So people should be warned of that so they don't freak out. That's if you're having the tincture or the tea directly on contact. It doesn't happen if you're taking it in capsule form. The research is all over the place as far as whether or not it works, which is probably due to a lot of different reasons. It is such a complicated plant, really. Like, it's not as simple as we want it to be. And there are some concerns that for some people it may aggravate an autoimmune flare. It does not happen that often, but it does happen sometimes. So if you feel like you get worse with echinacea, then definitely consider different remedies. But a lot of people feel well. Folks with Epstein-Barr virus chronic issues often feel better with echinacea. It really just depends on the person. So just a little bit more info on the chemistry and safety and drug interactions info there. Some different ideas for throat sprays. I've got a lot of bonus slides here. So bonus slide on throat sprays and then elderberry. And we'll just mention a little more and then I'm going to transition for a shorter allergy class. I never seem to have enough time to cover allergies adequately in this series, but we have a lot of cool things to say about that. So elderberry is another great remedy and it's different from echinacea. So echinacea is pretty broad spectrum. So I would consider it in a pretty wide array of like infectious weirdness. Echinacea, going back to here, echinacea is very broadly useful for a lot of different viral, bacterial types of infections. Elderberry is more specific and a lot less nuanced, but really helpful for what it does. And so the main thing that elderberry seems to do is it seems to go in that phase when the viruses are trying to break into the cells. What it seems to do is basically like put up a force field. So what it's really doing is it's blocking out the receptor sites that the viruses are latching onto in order to get into the cells and rendering it so the viruses are not as easily able to get into the cells. So you end up with a lot less viral load, especially if you start it in those early phases. It's the same kind of a concept for how lemon balm tends to work for the herpes virus. And on that note, elderberry does have some potential for herpes viruses and lemon balm does have some potential for other, like respiratory viruses. However, it seems like elderberry is a little bit more specific for like cold and flu and maybe COVID, and lemon balm's probably actually helpful for all of it, but has more research on the herpes side of things. So really great at that force field. So in that, it's really going to be best when you're exposed or at those early signs of exposure. And you can often feel it working. Like we were traveling in Italy and we managed to catch, unsurprisingly, some germs from my friend's kids. She's got 4 kids. Somebody's always sick. And we of course, we ended up getting sick just as we were going on our romantic 2 days without the family to Cinque Terre. And Shannon was, just sicker than I normally see him, like shakes and cold and fever and all sorts of weirdness. And so I gave him my elderberry, and he almost immediately within about 20 minutes started to feel a little better. Feel those, and I noticed this too when I take it. A lot of times you can sort of feel those symptoms receding a little bit, so you get a little bit of reprieve. And then after a couple hours, you could feel it starting to come back. And really, in those stages, it's best to be taking elderberry like every hour, every 2 hours. 3 to 4 hours is usually when I would start to feel symptoms kind of creeping back. And so ideally you'd want to be taking it before that. But if you notice it, you can take elderberry and you'll often notice it recede again. So really reducing the viral load seems to be best. And so there are studies on folks in early stages of cold and flu, flight travel, preventative and flight travel. It didn't necessarily prevent people from getting sick, but they seem to have a much less severe infection and shorter duration if they had elderberry versus not having elderberry. And I personally can just feel a big improvement, especially with, I really like the recipe that I just showed you how to make. I feel a difference with it more so than I do with others. And elderberry does have some downsides. It can make some people kind of nauseous, especially the seeds and especially the fresh berries. And the recipes, the teas, and the elderberry syrup that I showed you, they never make me nauseous, but I have gotten pretty violently nauseous from some of the commercial elderberry syrups and some of the commercial other elderberry products like gummies and things that I feel like should be great and convenient, but they don't seem to work as well for me personally, and they make me kind of nauseous. So different people are more or less sensitive to that nausea-inducing property of elderberry, but that's why I like the recipes that I showed you, especially the syrup and the teas. There is also benefit to the flower of elderberry. The flower of elderberries have some antihistamine-like action, so that can be helpful both in allergies and also in colds and flus, since the histamine response is part of what makes us feel so cruddy during an infection. It's part of the immune system response, but it also feels kind of cruddy. And the elderberry is not really, it's just helping us feel more comfortable versus suppressing the immune system. It also has some diaphoretic effects, so it helps break a fever, which is great because our fever response, as we mentioned earlier, is an important part of our body's ability to fight infection. On that note, sometimes people have to take a fever reducer because they just need to sleep well and be more comfortable. But if you can avoid taking fever reducing medications in those like mild to moderate fevers and let your fever do its job, oftentimes you'll have faster, better resolution of an infection versus when you're suppressing a fever. And even in pediatrics, I don't remember the exact cutoff point since I don't specialize in kids, but they generally don't recommend fever reducing medications anymore, at least up until a certain point of fever, that it's really not beneficial, and the fever is part of the body's way of fighting infections. And so diaphoretic herbs like elderberry, elderflower, ginger, yarrow, there are several others, but those are some classics, can often be really helpful for that. So there are some downsides. Elderberries and elderflowers properly prepared are usually really safe and well tolerated by almost everybody. However, fresh elder can be very nauseating and possibly a bit on the toxic side. There was a case of some people getting poisoned from fresh elderberry juice that was served at some sort of gathering. And so I would always cook or dry and only use elderberries or flowers. There are a few other differing opinions on that, but that's kind of the general word of wisdom, and usually that's fine. I would also use whole berries that you can strain out, like we just strain them out of that syrup, versus a powder, because the seeds are particularly nauseating. And so being able to strain it out of your final product seems to be really nice. Also with berries, they tend to precipitate some of those pigments, and benefits tend to precipitate out. They're related to tannins and polyphenols. And so a little bit of honey actually does help stabilize that a little bit. So syrups probably do have an advantage over, say, a tincture for a long-term shelf life. So having that honey or some other, glycerin actually has a similar activity, or some sugar syrup, not only does it make it taste good, but it probably also helps stabilize those tannins. If you think about when you open up a bottle of red wine, and if you forget about it for months and months, which happens pretty often in our house, oddly enough, and you go back to it, it's sort of like brownish and raisiny. That's sort of what happens to these. That's actually exactly what happens to these other berry-like things, and you will lose some of the benefits of the elderberry over time. So the more like pretty and purple and vibrant it is, usually it's a pretty good indication of potency. And I do have a whole blog on elderberry. I think that the likelihood for cytokine storm with elderberry is basically been disproven by science, but it's highly unlikely. I'm not concerned about that at all. And but if you feel like elderberry makes you feel worse, and you've ruled out that nausea thing that I was just talking about, then don't use elderberry, use something different. So I think that's most of what I really want to talk about in today's class. Ginger, or in today's immune part of the class, ginger, great mover and shaker. Fresh tends to be really good at helping to directly fight infections, viral, bacterial, also gut infections. Ginger tends to be really great at, it can help kill the pathogens while encouraging your beneficial flora at the same time, which is cool how herbs work that way. It's anti-nausea. It's anti-inflammatory, it's improves circulation, it's warming to the body, it's a diaphoretic. Ginger just has so much going for it. And while dry ginger does have some benefits, the fresh ginger is even more potently antiviral. And so lovely, lovely herb to consider if it agrees with you. And I've got a couple other recipes, a little side note on lemon mop that you can check out if you want to. oregano, bee balm, thyme, sage, rosemary, all really lovely, like antimicrobial aromatic herbs, particularly for the lungs and to utilize as steam. We're going to get more into the berberine rich herbs, hopefully in a moment as we transition to allergies. We might go over by a few minutes in class. So I apologize in advance. And I want to check on my recording. Okay, good. I always panic about that. So some people do use golden seal in for like respiratory infections. I generally personally don't. And if you do, the dosage would be much less frequent. It would just be like a couple, 2 to 3 times a day. It's not a systemic antimicrobial, so it doesn't go into the bloodstream and help fight infection elsewhere. It's mainly effective on contact, and it's more, in my mind, antibacterial and antifungal, but it does help dry up catarrh. It does do that systemically. So when you've got like lots of mucus, it is sort of drying, and it does fight things on contact. So it does have some potential in a throat spray, or if a viral infection is starting to turn bacterial, when like the mucus starts to turn like green and yellow, where you go to the doctors and they say you have a bacterial infection, I might consider berberine rich herbs, especially if I can deliver them directly to the area. So like in a sinus thing, if I can put them in a neti nasal wash or a throat spray, or if it's a GI infection, berberine rich herbs are fantastic because they're coming in contact. And it does also systemically, so swallow it and does it throughout the body. It does systemically improve the efficacy of antibiotics by helping the antibiotics. It helps prevent the bacteria from being able to be as resistant to the antibiotics. So it may or may not have that similar kind of synergistic effect alongside antimicrobial herbs for dealing with bacteria, but it is in many cases a potential addition to antibiotics for bacterial infections. But there are other potential herb drug interactions that you'd want to watch. And it's, I mean, a lot of these things you'd want to be cautious in pregnancy, but this one is definitely not safe and not recommended in pregnancy. So that's kind of the short thing. I generally think that the berberine rich herbs like golden seal are misused and usually not appropriate for colds and flus and things like that. There are other things that we just talked about that are a lot better. And then there are so many other herbs. So I threw in a lot of extra slides. Some of these are from the lung class to deal with different symptom patterns. Because once you are sick, then you just kind of address the symptom patterns in addition to the general immune support remedies that we talked about. So I have all these extra slides, and there's also that really great chart because there are just so many herbs that are potentially supportive for the immune system in lots of different ways. And always, always, always listen to your body. So that is, kind of the short thing. So we have a question. Why isn't golden seal appropriate with echinacea? I bought a glycerin extract together. So oftentimes golden seal and echinacea are combined. I think it's just bad marketing idea for the most part. If you have it, go ahead and take it. It's fine. Like, don't throw it away. It's still got some value, but the dosing for echinacea in an acute infection would be much more frequent than the dosing for golden seal. So in that respect alone, it really doesn't make sense to pair them together, even though a lot of companies do. And then also, I just personally, I don't think golden seal is a really, and the other berberine rich herbs are a really great choice for viral infections. It's just less specific for that, more specific on contact. So I use them topically on like a topical thing. I have throat spray that I can also use as a wound spray that's got echinacea and golden seal in it. But I do think that it's just kind of become this sort of popular herbal thing that people expect. And it's not really a great combo. It just doesn't really make sense once you really get to know the plants. And I'm definitely not the only herbalist who feels that way. But I mean, if you do have it on hand, I would consider it more for when it does seem like a viral infection might be turning bacterial. And especially if it's an infection that is maybe like a GI infection or something like that, where the berberine rich herbs are having a chance to come in contact with wherever those pathogens are. It's more specific for bacterial and fungal, but really much more on contact. It does have that systemic anti-catarrhal effect, so it will dry out mucousy stuff taking it internally. So it's another potential application, but more often I like to use things that thin and move mucus, like golden rod and horehound, when people are stuck with congestion. But there is some place for something like a berberine rich herb. So I have lots of extra resources for immune and also just COVID related resources, and some more COVID research. So we made our remedies already. So I'm gonna transition now into allergies, and I think I'm gonna actually pause and restart.